We didn't know a lot about what was happening in Los Alamos. Not outside of the occasional nugget in the month-old newspapers delivered to our outpost. But one day, when General Tusk was on site, I approached his office to deliver a briefing, and with my fist ready to rap the door, I heard Dr. Devenor talking. The floor was the dirty, spotted white of an egg, and the door was a cheap pale grain that could not hide their voices. I stood there, but couldn't quite bring myself to knock. Instead, I listened to the scraps of their conversation. Dr. Devenor's voice had a depth to it, refined by age and cigarettes. It could veer sharply between a bassoon's bellow and a violin's quiver. It was a fine thing to listen to, especially when embellished with the music of his accent. He was in the middle of some heated diatribe that I couldn't quite follow, but it concerned the nature of what we were doing here. The dangerous games we were playing with the world. "You think you are gods," he said. "Not merciful gods either, but gods of thunder. Gods of blood sacrifice. Do you really think history will look kindly on your efforts here?" The Major General muttered something in response, and Dr. Devenor's voice rose again. "You don't strike me as a man who reads, General Tusk. But you do seem like a man who enjoys the moving pictures. Have you seen the Universal Monsters? You probably see Boris Karloff and refer to him as Frankenstein like everyone else. That's wrong, of course. If you'd read the novel, you'd know better. You'd know him as the creature. But nonetheless, everyone now calls the monster Frankenstein. They call him that even though that's the name of the doctor. Do you know why? It's because you are what you create. There is a lesson there. You are not Major General Ambrose Tusk, no. No, you have a new name if you continue to carry out this plan of yours. And your name is war. I checked the hallway behind me, not wanting to be caught, then bent closer to the door. Now Dr. Devenor was speaking of Los Alamos. Nuclear tests were underway in the southwest, Utah and Nevada mostly. Sometimes the bombs were buried, sometimes the bombs were dropped from an aircraft. The seismic shocks could be felt hundreds of miles away. Windows cracked. Framed photos fell from walls, porcelain figurines danced off shelves and shattered on the floor. People began to take note of where and when these tests took place. They weren't angry, they were curious, and even delighted. It was all in the name of science and the war effort, yes? And so the military stopped trying to keep them away and instead designated areas where people were permitted to watch the tests. Families would picnic and snap photos and applaud when the warheads bloomed in the desert. And then one blustery day, a 10-kiloton atomic bomb melted the skin off a gathering of 50 people. A downwinder, it was called. The press had not reported it. The military had so far been able to keep the story quiet, but Dr. Devenor knew, and he was furious. Had they learned nothing? Was the utter failure and disaster that came out of the Tunguska event not enough of a warning? If the U.S. military was acting this reckless already, then what would they do once they harnessed the power of... It was at this point that the door flew open, and I was caught in the light of the office. Dr. Devenor stood there, his hand on the knob, his eyes peeled back white, his mustache bristling. He paused there only a moment before shaking his head and saying, "You're going to make these boys into unwitting murderers." And then he pushed past me. Wherever he went, he left behind the toasty smell of cigarette smoke. "Come on in, Warnock," General Tusk said. "Yes, sir," I said, and held up the stiff stack of papers in my hand. "I came to give you the briefing as requested." "How much of that did you hear?" I took a seat across from him. His desk was bare except for a coffee cup and a jar of pens. He wasn't present at the facility often enough to put much of a mark on it, but he had hung up a mounted set of antlers. When I sat, he stood, positioning himself in such a way that the horns seemed to grow out of his head. "I heard nothing, sir." "That is some bullshit," he said. The only thing I understand, sir, is that you and the doctor had a professional disagreement. That is a fine pile of bullshit you are serving me. He stood there, breathing fiercely through his nose another minute, before telling me to carry on then. He was ready for his briefing, and he hoped like hell I had good progress to share. Thanks.
I don't know why in the world I volunteered to follow that voice. Thanks everybody for coming out tonight. It is so awesome to see all these familiar faces in the crowd. Like I have, hey, yours too. And like I have like layers of of people here, like friends of mine from college, friends from grad school. Hey, like colleagues of mine when I taught at St. Thomas, neighbors, students, former students. It's very cool to see all of you here tonight. Thank you for coming. So I'm just going to read the first chapter of my new book, Wellness. Wellness is the story of a marriage. It's a story about Jack and Elizabeth, and they meet when they're these like hopeless romantic 20-somethings in Chicago, in the underground kind of music scene in the early 90s in Chicago, and fall immediately in love. And then after their meet cute, we fast forward 20 years, and life has happened. They're parents now, they've been married for a long time, and they're a little lonely, they're very overwhelmed, and they kind of look back at those hopeless romantics they used to be 20 years ago, and they kind of think, like, how could those people possibly be us? And the story then sort of excavates how they got to where they are, and also the hijinks that happen as they try to solve it. So I'm just going to read the first chapter. This is When They Meet. He lives alone on the 4th floor of an old brick building with no view of the sky. When he looks out his window, all he can see is her window, across the alley, an arm's length away, where she lives alone on the 4th floor of her own old building. They don't know each other's names. They have never spoken. It is winter in Chicago. Barely any light enters the narrow alley between them, and barely any rain either, or snow, or sleet, or fog, or that crackling wet January stuff the locals call wintry mix. The alley is dark and still and without weather. It seems to have no atmosphere at all, a hollow stitched into the city for the singular purpose of separating things from things, like outer space. She first appeared to him on Christmas Eve. He'd gone to bed early that night, feeling horribly sorry for himself, the only soul in his whole raucous building with nowhere else to be, when a light snapped on across the alley, and a small warm glow replaced his window's usual yawning dark. He sat up, walked to the window, peeked out. There she was, a flurry of movement, arranging, unpacking, pulling small, vibrant dresses from large matching suitcases. Her window was so close to him, and she was so close to him, their apartments separated by the distance of a single, ambitious jump. That he scooted back a few feet more to fully submerge himself in his darkness. He sat there on his heels and stared for a short while until the staring felt improper and indecent, and he contritely returned to bed. But he has, in the weeks since, come back to the theater of this window, and more often than he'd like to admit. He sometimes sits here, hidden, and for a few minutes at a time, he watches. To say that he finds her beautiful is too simple. Of course he finds her beautiful, objectively, classically, obviously beautiful. Even just the way she walks, with a kind of buoyancy, a cheerful, jaunty bounce, has him thoroughly charmed. She glides across the floor of her apartment in thick socks, occasionally doing an impromptu twirl, the skirt of her dress billowing briefly around her. In this drab and filthy place, she prefers dresses, bright flowered sundresses, incongruous amid the grit of this neighborhood, the cold of this winter. She tucks her legs under them as she sits in her plush velvet armchair, a few candles glowing nearby, her face impassive and cool, holding a book in one hand, the other hand idly tracing the lip of a wine glass. He watches her touch that glass and wonders how a little fingertip can inspire such a large torment. Her apartment is decorated with postcards from places he assumes she's been: Paris, Venice, Barcelona, Rome, and framed posters of the art he assumes she's seen in person: the Statue of David, the Pietà, the Last Supper, Guernica. Her tastes are manifold and intimidating, Meanwhile, he's never even seen an ocean. She reads inordinately at all hours, flicking on her yellow bedside lamp at 2 o'clock in the morning to page through large and unwieldy textbooks, biology, neurology, psychology, microeconomics, or various stage plays, or collections of poetry, or thick histories of wars and empires, or scientific journals with inscrutable names and bland gray bindings. She listens to music he assumes is classical for the way her head sways to it. He strains to identify book jackets and album covers, then rushes to the public library the next day to read all the authors that rouse and unsleep her, and listen to all the symphonies she seems to have on repeat: the Hafner, the Eroica, the New World, the Unfinished, the Fantastique. He imagines that if they ever actually speak, he will drop some morsel of symphony fantastique knowledge, and she will be impressed with him and fall in love. If they ever actually speak. She's exactly the kind of person, cultured, worldly, that he came to this frighteningly big city to find. The obvious flaw in the plan, he realizes now, is that a woman so cultured and worldly would never be interested in a guy as uncultured, as provincial, as backward and coarse as him. Only once has he seen her entertain a guest, a man. She spent an appalling amount of time in the bathroom before he arrived and tried on 6 dresses, finally picking the tightest one, a purple one. She pulled her hair back, she put on makeup, washed it off, put it back on, she took 2 showers, she looked like a stranger. The man arrived with a 6-pack of beer, and they spent what seemed like an awkward and humorless 2 hours together. Then he left with a handshake. He never came back. Afterward, she changed into a ratty old t-shirt and sat around all evening eating cold cereal in a fit of private sloth. She didn't cry, she just sat there. He watched her across their oxygenless alley, thinking that she was, in this moment, beautiful, though that word beautiful seemed suddenly too narrow to contain the situation. Beauty has both public and private faces, he thought, and it's difficult for one not to annul the other. He wrote her a note on the back of a Chicago postcard: "You would never have to pretend with me." Then he threw it away and tried again. "You would never have to be someone trying to be someone else." But he didn't send them. He never sends them. Sometimes her apartment is dark, and he goes about his night, his ordinary hermetic night, wondering where she might be. That's when she's watching him. She sits at her window in the darkness, and he cannot see her. She studies him, observes him, notes his stillness, his tranquility, the admirable way he sits cross-legged on his bed and persistently for hours just reads. He is always alone in there, his apartment, a desolate little box of unadorned white walls and a cinder block bookshelf and a futon condemned to the floor, is not a home that anticipates guests. Loneliness, it seems, holds him like a buttonhole. To say that she finds him handsome is too simple. Rather, she finds him handsome insofar as he seems unaware that he could be handsome. A dark goatee obscuring a delicate baby face, big sweaters disguising a waifish body. His hair is a few years past clean cut and now falls in oily ropes over his eyes and down to his chin. His fashions are fully apocalyptic. Threadbare black shirts and black combat boots and dark jeans in urgent need of patching. She's seen no evidence that he owns a single necktie. Sometimes he stands in front of the mirror, shirtless, ashen, disapproving. He is so small, short, and anemic and skinny as an addict. He survives on cigarettes and the occasional meal, boxed and plastic wrapped and microwavable, usually, or sometimes powdered and rehydrated into borderline edible things. Witnessing this makes her feel as she does while watching reckless pigeons alight on the L's deadly electrified lines. He needs vegetables in his life. Potassium and iron, fiber and fructose, dense, chewy grains and colorful juices, all the elements and elixirs of good health. She wants to wrap a pineapple in ribbon. She'd send it with a note, a new fruit every week. It would say, "Don't do this to yourself." For almost a month, she's watched as tattoos spread ivy-like across his back, now connecting in a riot of pattern and color that's migrating down his slender arms, and she thinks, I could live with that. In fact, there's something reassuring about an assertive tattoo, especially a tattoo that's visible even while wearing a collared work shirt. It speaks to a confidence of personality, she thinks, a person with the strength of his convictions, a person with convictions. Contrary to her own everyday inner crisis and the question that's dogged her since moving to Chicago, who will I become? Or maybe more accurately, which of my many selves is the true one? The boy with the aggressive tattoo seems to provide a new way forward, an antidote to the anxiety of incoherence. He's an artist, that much is clear, for he can most often be found mixing paints and solvents, inks and dyes, plucking photo papers out of chemical baths, or leaning over a light box inspecting film negatives through a small, round magnifier. She's amazed at how long he can look. He'll spend an hour comparing just 2 frames, staring at one, then the other, and then the first again, searching for the more perfect image. And when he's found it, he circles the frame with a red grease pencil. Every other negative is X'd out, and she applauds his decisiveness. When he chooses a picture, or a tattoo, or a certain bohemian lifestyle, he chooses devotedly. It is a quality that she, who cannot decide on even the simplest things, what to wear, what to study, where to live, whom to love, what to do with her life, both envies and covets. This boy has a mind calmed by high purpose. She feels like a bean jumping against its pod. He's exactly the kind of person, defiant, passionate, that she came to this remote city to find. The obvious flaw in the plan, she realizes now, is that a man so defiant and passionate would never be interested in a girl as conventional, as conformist, as dull and bourgeois as her. Thus, they do not speak, and the winter nights pass slowly, glacially, the ice coating tree branches like barnacles. All season, it's the same. When his light is off, he is watching her. When her light is off, she is watching him. And on the night she isn't home, he sits there feeling dejected, desperate, maybe even a little pathetic, and he gazes upon her window and feels like time is zipping away, opportunities gone. It feels like he is losing a race with the life he wishes he could lead. And on the nights he isn't home, she sits there feeling forsaken, feeling once again so bluntly dented by the world, and she examines his window like it's an aquarium, hoping to see some wonderful thing erupt from the gloom. And so here they are, lingering in the shadows. Outside, the snow falls plump and quiet. Inside, they are alone in their separate little studios, in their crumbling old buildings. Both their lights are off. They both watch for the other's return. They sit near their windows and wait. They stare across the alley into dark apartments, and they don't know it, but they're staring at each other. Thank you. Thank you.
Hey.
Yeah, good job. All right.
Yeah, let's kick it off. We'll open it up to the audience after a bit, but to start with, we're just gonna BS back and forth.
Yep.
And I'm gonna kick things off with the most professional, most probing of and literary of questions, and that is, tell me more about Oprah.
Oprah. She is wonderful, and she likes surprises. She doesn't like when her staff surprises her. In fact, she's forbidden her staff from surprising her, she told me, but she likes surprising other people. And so she surprised me on a Zoom call. Like, my publisher was putting together a Zoom call, a meeting, and it was like on some Wednesday in March. And they were like, we need you to come to this meeting. And I was like, yeah, March. We need you to come to this meeting. And I was like, what's the meeting about? And they were like, oh, nothing. And I was like, I'm busy. I had like a tennis match or something. I could have canceled it, but I didn't know Oprah was waiting for me, you know? And so I was like, no, well, let's just reschedule the meeting. They're like, okay, fine. And so they rescheduled it for like a Friday at 3. And so Friday at 3, I get a text, we're gonna have to push it back to 4. I'm like, okay. At 4, I get a text, we're gonna have to push it back to 4:30. And if you're bounced back that much on a Friday afternoon, you just feel like I am the least important person ever, right? And then I get on the Zoom call, and it's just the publicist from my publisher, and nobody else is on the call. And she says, do you mind if we record this so that all the people who are not here can watch it later? And I'm thinking, all right, they've just rescheduled it 3 times, and now they're not even showing up. Like, this is BS. And then I was like, fine, record it. So as soon as I allowed them to record it, then suddenly Oprah appears, and I'm like, oh, that's why they wanted to record it. Okay. And she says some very, very nice things about my book. She says she wants to put it in her book club, and I have no idea how to react in that moment. I'm just like aware that that's Oprah, and whatever's happening on my face will definitely be on some morning show someday. Yeah, so then I had to keep that secret for like 6 months until the book came out. I wasn't allowed to tell anybody, not even my parents knew. Yeah. So, which was actually kind of lovely because then the morning that it happened, I got to call them and be like, hey, watch CBS Mornings this morning, and also let's Zoom. And while we're Zooming, I hit record. A nice little trick I learned from Oprah. I hit record, and they're like, why are you recording this? I'm like, no reason. And then so I got to see them react to me being on the Oprah thing. So that was really fun. Yeah. Anyway, and she's lovely, by the way. She and Gail both came at me with like so many great questions about the book and like pages and pages of notes. Like they had read it, they had reread it, they were really thoughtful about it. It was amazing. She's a very good reader. Yeah.
Well, you have been knighted.
Yeah, that was quite a thing. Yeah. All right. I have a question for you. Okay.
Yeah.
Something that's always impressed me so much about Ben is how you're able to be so consistently good at so many different things and also so industrious at so many different things. Mm-hmm. I feel like, I mean, it takes me freaking 7 years to write one book. And in that time, you've written like 4 books and like 100 comics and like probably a couple screenplays. Like the WGA strike ended today, so I assume you've finished like 3 full screenplays today. You know? 4. So I guess what I want to know, just from a purely selfish reason, because I would like to be able to work faster, is like, what does both your work day look like and like your work week, in terms of like how do you manage so many different projects in so many different stages of development in so many different genres?
I'm industrious because I treat writing not like something I'm waiting for the muse to strike like lightning. I instead just sit down at the desk, you know, at 7:30 when the kids get on the bus, and I write until 4:30 or so when I get home. And yes, I am juggling all these different projects. I'm writing Wolverine and Ghost Rider and X-Force at Marvel, which is busy enough on its own, but I'm also working on these longer form projects, whether that's a TV show or a novel. And I tend to be a visual person, so I try to put this stuff up on the wall. I can't keep it all straight in my head. I have a closet just off of my office that was owned. I mean, the previous owner was a hobby photographer, and that was his dark room. And so it's kind of my nightmare factory. It's kind of it's the place I go in beneath the red light. I, look at all of these different articles that I've clipped out of magazines and tacked to a certain point of the wall. I look at character concepts. I look at these big story charts and blueprints that I have for longer work. And sometimes I'm thinking about a novel for a year before I actually begin to write it. And because of that, I have it all mapped out pretty exhaustively. And so I can, when I get to work on it, I'm moving swiftly as a result, and then at the same time, I'm, doing something marathonic like that. And I'm also working on these sprints, these comics, which are due sometimes like a script or 2 a week. And it requires a lot of compartmentalization. Where I'll be like, before lunch, I'm working on comics. After lunch, I'm working on editing this other project. Or for these 3 days, I will be working exclusively on the novel, so I can have more of a, immersive experience. I would like to work less. That would be nice, but I have trouble saying no when cool stuff pops up.
Yeah.
So I'm 10 years into writing for Marvel or DC right now. I'm thinking about maybe, throttling back a bit, and going all in on the screenplay stuff, especially now that after 5 months of being in the trenches, the strike is over, thankfully. With
a seemingly very good deal too.
It's a juicy one. So I have a question for you, and it has to do with this balance, the balance of voices, the balance of point of view. I always try to have like a challenge before myself, a stylistic challenge before myself, when I start a longer project, so that things feel fresh, so that I feel like I'm always like not in a rut, not in a plateau, but instead, reaching for something higher. When I'm thinking about this book, it looks like a really interesting stylistic challenge. And I'm thinking about Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about shows like The Affair, where you have this sort of he said, she said perspective. I'm curious to hear more about that balance, maintaining that balance, and also just like the way in which you handle that omniscience, that sort of limited omniscience, but there's a turnstile effect happening throughout.
Yeah, that's those were touchstones for me as I was writing this. This book is like a marriage story, but I wanted to write this story that was where you got to know the characters the way I describe it is you get to know them forwards and backwards at the same time, and it's kind of the same way you get to know the people in your lives. You know, like any partner you might have, you get to know them forwards by going on dates and living with them, moving in, whatever. But you also get to know them backwards by like you hear their old stories, you meet their old friends, you see where they grew up, you meet their parents, and you kind of come to this synthesis of who they were. You get to know them forwards and backwards at the same time. And I really want the challenge, the stylistic challenge I set up for myself, or maybe the structural challenge I set up for myself, was to write a book where you got to do that. You got to have that for the characters. And just like in real life, you know, when you know someone more and more intimately, you maybe get to see their darker sides. They reveal a little bit more to you. And so I wanted the characters to kind of do that too. And so I was like, can I write something where it doesn't feel like flashback? That every chapter, no matter at what time period it's in, feels like it's pushing the story forward, even if it happened 20 years ago. And so that was a real headache producer. Like that I don't know how many different, I have one wall in my office that's covered in corkboard and note cards, and I don't know how many times I had to like take down all the note cards and do something new, because it either something wasn't working, or I have a feeling I'm a much poorer outliner than you, because I feel like I'm in the chair, and sometimes something will come to me in the process that is so much more surprising or delightful than anything I put on the corkboard, than anything I thought of in the outline, and I always lean into that surprise, and mostly it's just because if it surprises me in the chair or delights me in the chair, I think a reader will like it too, and so that necessarily makes me take down the corkboard and then I put it back up with this new thought in mind. So there's a sort of like conversation that's happening all the time between the outline and the actual writing that's going on every day. But yeah, so I wanted to have this, I don't know, this sense of a deepening intimacy about a synthesis between past and present, because I mean it just strikes me as someone who's just been married for a long time and you know, been alive long enough to see like friends radically change, and then you talk to them and they have a linear story about how their story is the right one, you know what I mean? And I got the sense that we all sort of like have these stories about who we are and who our partners are and what the world is like, and those stories are so malleable. They change based on circumstances, but in our minds they kind of don't. In our minds they feel inevitable, and they're really not. You know, they're always warped in some way, and it was that warpage that really was interesting to me. So I needed to have a sort of omniscient third-person narrator, because how can you write a story where what the two characters believe isn't true? You know, like you have to be able to pull out just a little bit. So I'm in a very close third person for most of the time, but every once in a while I kind of pop out, and like it's some kind of new implied narrator. And I just decided, even though probably people in my MFA program would have yelled at me in a workshop for that, to just do it because I liked it and it just felt right, even if it was a little narratively inconsistent in places. I just liked the effect of it. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, yeah. I mean, that unreliability, which we commonly think of as something that belongs to the first-person narrator, like you're playing with that in omniscient mode, and then disproving it by pulling away and having a more godlike perspective.
Yeah, and I
did. It absolutely would have been poo-pooed by
yes.
a creative writing workshop.
Yes.
I love how it's like, you know, you move forward through the years, like all those strict guidelines were the point of view police. I used to think of that as referees running along the sidelines of the story, blowing their whistle.
Totally.
You start to just be like, you know what, I don't need those rules anymore. I'm gonna, make my own way.
Yeah, this is. I remember when I was writing the Knicks, and like some sections of the Knicks felt like this needs to be in past tense, and some sections of the Knicks I was like, this needs to be in present tense, and I was like, well, obviously I can't do that. I have to tell it all in past tense or all in present tense, and I got to thinking like, why do I believe that? It's just because, like, I don't know, people said so a long time ago, and like that's just the rule. I'm like, well, screw that. Like, I'm just gonna. So it was hilarious to me when I finally changed it. I'm like, sometimes it's in past tense, sometimes it's in present tense. It's just like whatever is needed for the dramatic situation. And like, I got zero pushback from any reader ever about that. You know, like. I got pushback for other things. Yeah, right. Right. I wanted to ask you about one of the things I really like about your novels is how, I mean, there's always something fantastical happening. You know, it's like there's a post-apocalyptic landscape, or you know, it's the gold rush but an alien metal. You know, So you've got these fantastical elements in there, but the stories are all so grounded, and especially grounded in people and emotion. And so I guess I'm curious about like, about how you balance those interests. So how much of the the fantastical or the science fiction to push, and when to pull back on it, and be more character driven. I'm just curious about how you go about that.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at stories that are about like squid aliens or time travel theory or a ninja train or if you look at these fantastical scenarios, like, it doesn't matter how awesome those concepts might be, if you don't have like a beating heart at the center of your story, nobody cares. Comic books are a bombastic medium. I work in comics, and one of the things that comics have taught me is like, I see the most exaggerated version of storytelling, and I learn how to tamp that down. And I see in comic books sometimes people getting carried away with like the adrenaline, or getting carried away with these concepts that enchant them, and forgetting about the fact that like we don't really care about the fact that the world is going to be destroyed, or the solar system, or the galaxy, or the universe, or this timeline, or whatever. Like that's almost too much for us to grapple with. I think we're seeing more of that right now with the Marvel fatigue that's going on in the theaters. And instead, what really matters to us is like saving that kid, or saving that cat, or saving that marriage. And so I always try to keep that soulfulness in mind. In fact, when I have like these scrolls on my office wall, these blueprints that I was talking about before, I'll have at the very top of them that high concept umbrella statement, like this is a post-apocalyptic retelling of the Lewis and Clark saga, or whatever. That's the banner statement. But along the left side of that scroll, I have characters, kind of Wikipedia entries, even sketches or cartoons of them. Once I figure out who they are, I figure out what they want. And once I figure out what they want, I start to put obstacles in the way of that desire, like a cruel god. And that's when I have the first stirrings of plot. So really, plot comes out of character for me. Even though I am, pretty strict in my outlines. I mean, I have to be, because you don't get $1 billion property. They don't hand you Batman, they don't hand you Wolverine without a plan. You can't just be like, Wolverine's awesome, let me write him. Instead, I say, Wolverine's awesome, you better let me write him, and here's a 50-page Bible that describes exactly what I'm going to do with the character for the next 5 years. And with Hollywood, it's the same way. And you've had brushes with this, where they want to have meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting to figure out exactly what this thing is going to look like when they invest all that money into it. So you have to put together these Bibles for a show, and then you have to put together breakdowns for episodes, and then you have to endure endless notes. And as a result, that it just gets ingrained in me that that's the way I think about storytelling. But I think it's really important what you were saying before, and that you have to allow the characters to take over. You have to be able to improvise along the way. I try to think of my outlines as like constellations, where I have these bright stars. I know they're going to hit this point. I know they're going to hit this point. I know they're going to hit this point, but there's a vacancy between them, like a constellation in the sky, like dark spaces, where I can make those decisions that are in the moment. And I can take a hard left turn. And so every outline is sort of written in pencil instead of ink as a result of that. So it's always character first for me, no matter how wild and crazy I get with the other stuff. But the theme for the night was magical thinking. And I was thinking about your work, and even though the books might seem disparate, like you think about the way in which I have some speculative fiction going on the page, but your characters are engaged in kind of speculative fiction, right? If you think about this notion of wellness, if you think about the cult of wellness that they find themselves in, right? That there's a kind of fantasy life that they're exploring there that's ungrounded from reality.
Yeah, I think that's right. And like, I think like we write very different books, but like if you squint and look at it from a distance, like it's I think we're both dealing with, we both are interested in what normal people do when presented with kind of an extraordinary thing, and also what people do with technology, or what people And so I'm interested in like, video gamers or wellness cults or or even like fitness trackers. Like what does take normal life and have the addition of technology or which can be in some ways weirdly supernatural, and like what does that do to us? So, and I feel like you're mining a lot of the same territory. So I was told by someone earlier that like they were looking at like some Twin Cities magazine piece about like 5 weird things to do this weekend, and we were one of them. It's like this reading was one of the 5 weird things to do in the Twin Cities, and I was like, is that because it's a reading or because we're just a weird pairing? I don't know, but I kind of embrace it. I love that.
On that note, like just following up on that and furthering it. So I was reading some Stephen King, rereading some Stephen King, and I was thinking about the way in which he's always making pop references, but the pop references endure. Like, here's a book I'm reading from the 1980s, but I know that song he's talking about. Mm-hmm. And it occurred to me that you can't do that as well right now.
Yeah.
Right? Because we have these fiefdoms, almost, that we inhabit. Like, there are a few shared stars, the Taylor Swifts and such. But people are almost like circling the wagons around these different things that they're interested in. And so when you're making these zeitgeisty cameos, in your work, or you're exploring these things like video games or Fitbits or whatever else, do you ever think about the expiration date on them?
That's such a good question. I totally do. And usually when I realize there is going to be an expiration date, I make the thing up. So in the Knicks, there's a pop star, and I just made up her name and her song. She's very close to a sort of Miley Cyrus kind of person, but I was just like, in 5-10 years, I don't know if people are going to get that reference anymore. So I made up her name. And in wellness, there's the Fitbit thing is called The System, and yeah, Jack is on the system, and it measures. It measures everything, and none of I have this chapter where he's like trying to make his biceps bigger, and he's doing everything he possibly can to make his biceps bigger, and it's just not working. And he's measuring his macros and his calories and his intakes and whatever, and he's measuring. I mean, he's measuring like his relations with his wife. Like it's that. But like none of the things that I mentioned there that are being measured are fake. That's all real. Like I looked all this up. Like there are apps that measure all of this stuff, and so it's so funny. Like you can take what actually happens in the real world, give it a different name, and people are just like, "Wow, what great satire!" I'm just like, no, I'm repeating the same shit we that's just happening, But like you put it in a book, give it a slightly different name, and suddenly it shifts it. And if I can get a little pointy-headed about it for a second, I was really moved a long time ago. I read that there's this literary theorist named Victor Shklovsky. He was a Russian formalist who was written in the 1920s, and he writes about that art's job is to defamiliarize the world. And his argument was that we can become habituated to the world very, very easily. We can become habituated to our spouse. We can become habituated to war. Just we can get used to a lot. And one of the points of art is to extend perception so that we're not habituated to it anymore. And he says that you need to return the stone's stoniness, which means like we take how stony a stone is for granted, but if you can encounter a piece of art that reminds you of what it feels like to touch a stone, then the art is doing its job. And so I was very, very moved by that a long time ago, and so that's kind of been a guiding light for me. It's like, take this stuff that we all kind of do, that we all kind of take for granted, but like put it all in one place, give it a slightly different name, and suddenly we all kind of see it again, And I feel like I do that over and over and over.
Yeah. And you're allowed to become timeless as a result too.
Yeah, because then they don't have.
Because I mean, even referencing something like Twitter, like it doesn't exist anymore. It's now X.
I know. I think I might have mentioned Twitter in the book.
X might not even exist in 2 weeks.
Right. Last question before I think we should open it up to. Yeah. So I'm just starting my book tour. You've been on book tour for 3 weeks. I'm going to share one funny story that happened on book tour, and you share one funny story because book tour is weird. I was just in Miami at Books and Books a couple nights ago, and the owner of the store was talking to this group about what the book is about, and he was mentioning it's about wellness culture and it's about algorithms, and it's got this weird subplot about polyamory, and this retired woman right in the middle, like one of those people is just Miami people is just not afraid to just yell in the middle of an event, goes, "What'd you say?" And he says, "Polyamory," and she says, "Pollyanna?" He was like, "No, polyamory." And she's like, "Polyamory?" And just kept, it was like the most wonderful. I'm just sitting there back there just like laughing. She has no idea. And her husband leans over and whispers something in her ear, and she's like, "Oh." Anyway, that's I just started my book tour, already funny things are happening. So how about you? How about your book tour? How's it going?
It's going great so far. As for funny things, I don't know if I have anything that lives up to that, but my daughter has been playing tennis lately. She actually just got bumped up to the varsity tennis team as a freshman. Very proud. Anyways, all the girls will line up and watch the matches, and they'll call out to her, "No mercy from Percy!" And that's been kind of her tagline for the season. And just the other night, book tour can be like a really enlivening experience, fantastic experience, and it can also be a very humbling experience. And just the other night at Prairie Lights, the legendary Prairie Lights down in Iowa City, I was introduced as Benjamin Mercy. So I guess it runs in the family.
No mercy from Percy. Yeah, it is humbling. A friend of mine, a neighbor, bought my book, and then somebody stole it off his porch before he could get to the box. And then somebody showed up a couple days later and was like, "I found this open box in the gutter 2 blocks away." I'm like, okay, somebody took this box, opened it, saw it was my book, was like, "This is trash." We would be happy to answer whatever questions you have.
Yeah, hit us. The art, the craft, the business, whatever.
Yeah, thank you.
In reference to the pop culture, Nate, how much time did you spend researching and listening to Kids Bop?
Thank you for the Kids Bop. I have a friend, so we have this really tight, close circle of friends down in Naples. There's these 4 other couples that Jenny and I would hang out with and travel with, and we're all about the same age. We all moved to Florida at about the same time, and the other 4 couples all had kids at exactly the same time. I don't know if they planned it that way, but it was weird. They all had kids at about the same time, and so I was watching them all kind of grow up, and one of our friends, I would go over to their house, and it was nothing but Kids Bop. Nothing but Kids Bop every time. And I'd just be like, "What is this?" She's like, "It's Kids Bop." And it sounded awful to me, and I was like, "Why do you listen to this?" And she's like, "'Cause it's just one less thing I have to worry about." Like, if I don't want to have to police everything, so if I just put on Kids Bop, it was just she was just overwhelmed, and so she's like, if I don't have to worry about what they're listening to, great, just one less thing, one thing to take off the checklist. So yeah, so I wanted to use Kids Bop because I thought it was like there's.
Kids Pop, just to clarify, is like the Wiggles. Is that?
I don't know what the Wiggles.
You need to research more.
Sorry, for anybody who doesn't know, Kids Bop is like pop songs covers done by children for children, with all of the lyrics changed, so it's like family friendly now. And it's and so all the songs are kind of scrubbed of their meaning, so it's like they sound vaguely the same, but if you really listen to them, it's just gibberish, because all the lyrics have been changed. And like one part of wellness, like a kind of sub theme that's happening a lot, is just like challenges to objective reality. Like people, like in every chapter, there's some kind of problem with just figuring out what's real. And in that chapter, it's Kids Bop. And so she hears this song playing, and she's like, "Wait, that's not the song that I thought I knew. That's a different song." And so I just looked up the Kids Bop discography, and I was like, what is the most ridiculous song that they've ever covered? And like, what's the most sexual song that they desexualized? And I decided it was Timber, and used that.
And you nailed it.
Yeah.
On the subject of looking things up, the Elizabeth has like just reference after reference of like, you know, Zygmunt et al. Like 1994. Like, how many of those? I can never tell if like, because you make things so real that are fiction. Like, are those? Did you actually do like all the research into all this psychology and then like throw it, or was it like made up?
Yeah. He's talking about this chapter where Elizabeth is. I tried to dramatize 1 hour of toddler childcare, and it's like 30 pages long, and it's and Elizabeth is the kind of person who wants all of her childcare decision making to be informed by the best science, and so. I was reading a lot of child psychology in order to kind of get at this, and then I realized like this is what she does. She's a behavioral psychologist, and so I was like, well, she's going to be thinking in citations. She's going to have those right at the tip of her mind. So, and she'd be used to seeing citations on the page, because I was becoming very used to seeing citations on the page as I read all these studies, and so I was like, wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be a nice character moment if I dropped all of these citations into the actual chapter? And then once I did it once, I was like, well, now I have to do it for real. And so all of those citations, and I think she cites somewhere between 60 and 80 studies in that chapter, they're all real. And so I needed a bibliography at the end, which is like 20 pages long, which people have made fun of me deeply about, but to accommodate all those citations. But it's again, like, I don't know, it goes to a larger point in the book about like, we all kind of know the problem of misinformation or disinformation, but she's sort of a victim of information overload, which is its own kind of problem with reality, right? Like, if you're exposed to this fire hose of information all the time, but don't have the context for it, and maybe don't have the wisdom to put that information where it belongs, then that can be just as devastating. And so that's her problem, is information overload. And she's got access to so much info that it's driving her mad, which is, I don't know about you, it's something I feel a lot. You know.
Other questions from the crew? You're not allowed to leave until you ask 2 more.
For both of you, I'm just curious, when you are in the thick of a project, like a novel that's really intensive, when you're not at the desk, is there an activity or something recreational you do that's like a thing where you have like those amazing aha moments, or something happens in your book? Is there just something that helps with that creative spark?
Hobbies? Who has hobbies? But I do find that a lot of stuff comes unglued, comes uncaked when I'm walking or running. When I'm out in the woods especially, there's an Arb, the Carlton Arb, in Northfield, Minnesota, that I like to tromp around on. And it seems like as long as I go in intentionally, if I'm, going through the prairie and the woods and I'm thinking about this plot point that I've been stuck on, all of a sudden it presents itself just through physical movement. There's probably some sort of chemical release, but I remember Anne Lamott saying many years before, I heard her give a reading, and she said, all you need to do to be a writer is go for a walk every day. And I thought that was ridiculous. There's been a truth to it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I agree, and this is also why like I find it important to keep up the practice, like to write every day. Like I'll maybe take 1 day off a week just to reset, but like I really try to do it every day, because I find that, and I try to do it every day, and also stop myself before I know I could probably write 2 more pages, but I will stop myself before that, so that those 2 pages are available to me the next day, and I can start really quickly and easily. And in that 24 hours, it's weird. Like, as long as I'm doing anything that's in no way like cognitively overloading, like the subconscious just plays with this stuff, beneath the surface, and like just. And I feel like when the days are kind of calm and like, I don't know, I go for a bike ride or go play tennis, like, and then in the shower afterwards I'm like, oh yeah, it's like always those kinds of moments where it's just like your brain's been working on a problem and you didn't even know it was, so it's really a matter of like being physical, kind of getting out of your head, but also doing it every day, so that it becomes the lens through which you see the world, if that makes sense.
most difficult decision you had to make this most recent endeavor for both of you? Like, character X can do A or B. Can you elaborate on the most difficult decision or a difficult decision you had to make as a writer?
If you couldn't hear that, he asked about the most difficult decision we had to make in these recent books. For me, this is book 3 of the Comet cycle, but from the get-go, I knew that I didn't want to write a series where you had to read this book, and then this book, and then this book, because I knew there'd naturally be attrition as a result of that. I wanted to write a cycle of novels instead, where you could read them in any order, and they came together as a kind of family or bestiary. In the same way that, the work of comics, right? You can read Batman, you can read Superman, you can read Wonder Woman and Green Lantern, and they're individual titles, but they are woven together into this larger narrative tapestry. Or the work of Louise Erdrich, or the work of William Faulkner, or the work of Minnesota's Peter Guy. They're doing the same thing with like geographies and with families over the decades. I'm trying to do the same thing with these books, but I knew that with book 3, nonetheless, I still had to give people something, because this could be the last book, or this could be infinitely generative. I was trying to create my own sort of DC or Marvel universe here, because as much fun as it is to write for Marvel and DC, as much fun as it is to write Wolverine, my favorite comics character, those characters don't belong to me. So, I created this sandbox with this trigger event of the comet streaking through our solar system and the planet spinning through the debris field and everything getting shaken up as a result. But I had to, in this third book, which could be a kind of finale, both open a door to what could be coming next, and also close the door to some satisfaction on what had happened so far. Because I have, now that the strike is over again, I have this pilot written with Sony, I have this show pitch ready to go, and we can finally take it out to streamers, and they want to shoot it here in Minnesota, and we'll see what happens, and if that happens, I'm going to write 30 more books. But if it doesn't happen, then maybe there are only 3. I don't know. So, yeah, the tricky thing for me was, the most difficult thing for me was making people feel like, all right, I feel satisfied by the story arc, but also what's next.
I think the most difficult thing for me is I really get so close to my characters. They're living with me so much that when I have to kill one, I feel it. I really feel it. I don't know if anybody's read my first book. There's a character named Ponage, and he has this episode near the end of the book where he's trying to quit video games, and then he just cannot quit video games, and he goes in this bender, and it's 30 hours later, and he collapses. And in my first draft, he died in that chapter. He died, and then a week later, I was still moping. My wife was like, "What is wrong with you?" And I was like, "Ponage," and she's like, "Still?" I'm like, "Yeah." And then it wouldn't, my malaise wouldn't go away until I wrote the next chapter where it's like, "Nope, he's in the hospital, he's fine." And then I was like, "Oh, thank God." And the same thing happened with this book. It's a little late in the book, so I won't give anything away other than there's a tragedy. And it was hard to read. It was hard to write and hard to read. I read all of my first drafts to my wife, and just aloud. She hears the whole book in out of order, and I couldn't read that without crying, And so that was easily the hardest thing to write, for sure.
If there is one more, we can do it.
I'll ask.
Got
One more?
Oh yeah.
All right.
So you mentioned the word sandbox, and I've heard you use that term before as well, that it's this place you go to play, right? And so how much does your writing still feel like playing in the sandbox?
I do have a lot of deadlines before me. I work with corporations, corporate properties, and as much fun as that can be, sometimes it also is it's just such a constant, breathless sprint that I might whine occasionally to my wife about. But at the same time, I'm trying to constantly remind myself, you're so lucky to be doing this. Every time I sit down at the desk, I do feel that gratitude. But as a result of that, the novels feel more like play.
Yeah.
Or the short story that I might write.
Right.
And I have no idea what might happen with it. Maybe I'll sell it to an anthology or a journal or a magazine. I don't even know. It's just, you know, I'm writing it for the love of the game rather than for the deadline.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to have that sense of play. Otherwise, yeah, it can become drudgery. And I want to, you know, I want to be excited to run to the desk every day.
Yeah, I'm in way less demand than Ben, so so I don't have any deadlines in front of me right now, so it always feels playful. I kind of made a deal with myself, like when I was writing the Knicks, and I kept that deal up with wellness, which is that like this business is so unpredictable, and like you never know if your book is going to find an audience. You never know if this is going to be your last thing. So if that's true, then you might as well have fun while you're doing it. Like it might as well be enjoyable in the chair in the moment. And so like whatever, like, I don't know, humor or joy there is on the page in my books just comes from me just like pursuing that daily in the chair, you know? And so yeah, it's what's not fun, like that's the sandbox. Like the composing it is the sandbox. What's not fun is a lot of the stuff that happens then later when it's like it gets into the marketplace and like you're really aware of how much of a consumer object it becomes. Like when Amazon shows you your book in comparison to a human-sized person, it's like this is how big the package is, you know? It's just like yeah, it's a book, and like I don't know, and like you know, like people are shitty about it on websites or book reviews, and like, you know, like then that's just like okay, you know, then that's not very fun. But always like in the moment of the moments of creation are usually pretty enjoyable, and if they're not enjoyable, then I know I'm doing something wrong and I need to find that again.
You want people to say mean things about you on the internet. You should write comments.
Try writing comments. On that lovely note, nobody here would ever do that. No.
That's supposed to be a joyful question.
All right. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank
over.
you, everybody.